Thank you for the Can Group for inviting me to speak this evening. So yes, we're going to talk about British bats. That was where the whoop was meant to be. We'll do that again. We're going to talk about British bats. Yay! What better way to get ready for Halloween, right? So I didn't know what the audience was going to be like tonight. So I'm going to test the waters just to see how much we know about bats. So does anyone know how many bat species we have in the UK? 15? Any advance on 15? I know you know the answer, Claire. That's cheating. 20, a little bit less than 20, somewhere between 15 and 20. 18, yes, indeed. Do you know how many species of bats we have worldwide? Hundreds? Any advance on hundreds? 300? About 1,500. And both in the UK and across the world, they make up about a quarter of all mammal species. So they're a really diverse group. But because of their habits, people don't tend to know very much about them. Our bats in the UK are not nocturnal, and so if you're very lucky, you might see them flitting about, but that's kind of all the contact that we have, other than popping to the zoo and seeing those massive great fruit bats that hang in the cages there, which are very different from the species we have in the UK. So what are we talking about then? So it has these huge ears, and we've mentioned that they're nocturnal. Does anyone know how they navigate in the dark? Sound? Yes, absolutely. Hearing? Can you hear that? So these are ultrasonic calls that bats produce, and by and large, they're way above our hearing range. This is a nocturnal bat, and of all of our species, it's one of the lowest ones. So if you're particularly young or have got good hearing, you might catch just the kind of bottom end of these calls as they emerge to feed on an evening. And they're very similar to swallows and swifts in that they come out, and as the swallows and swifts are going to bed, the nocturals come out and they kind of get tagged in, and then they keep on eating the insects that the swallows and swifts were eating. Could you hear the kind of chip chopping noise there? What do we have next? It's a very quiet bat. Is it coming? Yes. So the nocturnal is a bat of the open, so it's a very loud bat. I'm just going to turn this up slightly. This is a bat of the clutter, so in the middle of woodlands, in amongst trees, and instead of that kind of very loud, slappy, wet noise, we have very rapid, dry clicks, and these are designed for hunting at a very short distance, whereas the nocturnal is a bat of the open, so forages over much greater distances. Who else have we got hidden in the dark here? We've got something in the middle. It's kind of a bit clicky, but a bit slappy as well. This is a pipistrelle bat. So if you've seen a bat out flying on an evening, more than likely is this species here. And I'm going to show you how you can mimic a pipistrelle bat now. You're going to have to join me, okay? So we have a wet, slappy sound. So you grab your cheek, and then you slap it against your mouth. Ready? I can see people not holding cheeks here. There we go. Oh, I've got a fun job. This is great.
You win a bet.
It's amazing what peer pressure can do. So that's our pipistrelle bats. They are our most common species in the UK, pretty much found everywhere, widespread in cities, in the countryside, and everywhere in between. And who do we have left? Does anyone remember the clangers? We have our bats from Mars here, these wonderful warbly spaceship sounds. And these are the sounds of our horseshoe bats. And I mentioned we have 18 bat species in the UK. 16 of them are fairly normal, and then there are two just complete outsiders, two lunatics called the horseshoe bats that are so different from all the others. Their echolocation sounds entirely different, and instead of echolocating through their mouths, like most bats do, they actually echolocate through their nose. And the horseshoe name comes from the shape of their nose leaf, which looks like a horseshoe. Got a curve at the bottom, we'll see one a bit later on. It's a good sound, right? It's a bit bassy, actually. Right, enough of that. So we saw the brown long-eared on the previous slide, as the name suggests. They're brown and they've got big ears. But they're not the only bats with big ears. And because they rely so heavily on echolocation, these ears are really important to the bats. And we can learn a lot about the bat based on the size and the shape of its ears. So the bigger the ears, the quieter the echolocation, and the shorter distances it travels and feeds. And the smaller the ears is vice versa, because they shout and they forage over much greater distances. And it tells you also things about their wing shape and the food they feed on and all sorts of things. So what do our British bats eat? Moths, insects, absolutely, yes. So we've got lots of different flying insects here. We've got beetles, we've got lacewings, wasps, moths, biting midges, all those types of things. It's quite standard. You think, okay, that makes sense. It's a flying predator and taking flying prey. They also take things like grasshoppers, shield bugs, spiders, and earwigs. That's a bit mad, isn't it? And even caterpillars and millipedes. So how do they go about catching these then? How do they catch their prey, do you think? Swoop down? Yeah?
Scent?
Scent? Oh, do they use scent? I'm not sure if they use scent to feed. They definitely use scent when they're communicating with one another.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's a good question.
I know.
Got homework now. You might recognise this. This is Wootton. So I'm going to talk through how they catch their prey. So starting with swooping in, there's lots of prey that just fly through, like this beetle, just minding his own business, and then a bat flies in and grabs hold of it. Lovely stuff. And we call these aerial hawkers. So they're catching their prey on the wing. The bat's flying, the insect's flying. Bosh. Easy, right? We have some bats which are a bit lazy. So our horseshoe bats, I mentioned how they're completely different to everything else. So they're flying, they find some cows, something where there's lots of dung, and essentially they'll wait for their prey to come to them. So the dung beetles come in and go, oh yeah, lovely, bit of food. They start chomping on that, and the bat goes, fantastic, I'll go and eat that. It will then fly back to its perch, and it will wait for the next beetle to come along. Why go out for food when food can come into you, right? This is Deliveroo, but engineered by bats. And we call these perch hunters. This species I mentioned about horseshoes are really bizarre. They're very restricted to the southwest of the UK. The greater horseshoe in particular is actually a success story in conservation. I've been working in conservation for approaching 20 years now, and it's a bit doom and gloom. It kind of just like, oh, things get worse and worse and worse. And one day, a couple of years ago, a video appeared that talked about this species having contracted down to kind of like Devon, Dorset area, suddenly appearing in Sussex. And through concerted effort for protecting where they live and where they feed, this species has not only managed to recover, but actually re-expand into some of its former range. So it shows we can turn the tide if we have the time, the inclination, and the know-how. So we're in the right area for this. And this is a lovely graphic. I have an amazing artist called Ed who does wonderful graphics for me. So you can see the dung beetle here, rolling up his dung. You can see some cowpats and the flies around. And we've got the horseshoe bat just hanging in the tree, waiting for its food to come to it. What else have we got? We've got Dorbenton's bats, and they like foraging over water. So there's lots of insects that come out of the water, especially think about mayflies and things like that. So they are specialists of flying very low and steady over the water, and they pick the insects off. So it's kind of like aerial hawking, but slightly adapted at that level. So are prey just kind of sitting back and taking this? Or do you think they're going to come up with some kind of defence then? I see nods. What could prey do, you think? If they're hearing these echolocation calls, what could the prey do to try and avoid being eaten? Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, they need to develop ears. They need to hear the bats coming. So not all insects can do this. But our noctuid moths, tiger beetles, green lacewings, and dung beetles have got ears. So when a bat comes along, they just drop out of the sky because the bat can't catch them if it can't find them, right? So that's one thing. They can listen to the bats and they take evasive action. They've also developed camouflage. So this is a group of researchers working in Bristol Uni. I think this was featured on Springwatch last year, where they made a model of this diagram here. And this is a close-up of a moth scale on its wing. And the principle basically is that as sound hits this, you've got different shapes and sizes, and they all oscillate slightly differently. If you think about when the wind blows and it hits a tree, and you see the branches moving, the leaves twist and small branches move, but by the bottom of the tree, nothing's moving, is it? It's dissipating all of that energy as the wind hits it. That's kind of what's happening here. The different shapes and sizes take out different frequencies of sound. So what the researchers did is they fired sound waves at a moth at the top there and at a butterfly wing at the bottom. So you can see on the left-hand side what it looks like in daylight. On the right is the reflective echo. So the moth at the top, you can barely see any trace on that, where compared to the butterfly that hasn't had to evolve these defensive, flying around in the day, just reflects sound as normal. They also found that some species use decoys. So if the bat's going to track you down and find you, it's much better that they take a part that's not particularly sensitive. So they have highly reflective wing tips and have that camouflage towards the body. So if the bat zooms in and grabs you, they might just take the wing tip, in which case the moth can carry on flying to fly another night. There's some species as well that kind of essentially jam radar or mimic the bats. And there's a fantastic YouTube video. If you put in bats and moths and mimicry, you'll come up with this video. And you can kind of see the still I've taken there of the bat coming in, and it plays some sonar and it shows that little animation of it coming in. And then as soon as the moth hears that, it produces its own ultrasound to confuse the bat. And the bat doesn't know what sound is echolocated and what's reflected and what's coming from the insect. It's cool, isn't it? So we see this arms race, as we see time and time again in evolution. You don't just see one species or group of species just kind of sitting back and taking it, because effectively they just go extinct, wouldn't they? So we see this adaptation. So then bats have to respond to this. So they've got species that can hear them now and take evasive action. They've got camouflage going on or mimicry going on. So then one of the reasons why we have bats with such big ears, we saw the brown long-eared on the first few slides, then we saw this is the Bechstein's bat. Again, really big ears on this bat. And that's because they forage without echolocating, or they get to a point and they turn the echolocation off. And the ears are so big they can just hear the bats. And earlier on, I showed you what they eat, and we saw millipedes in there. And the way that some bats get those is by foraging on the ground. So just because they can fly doesn't mean they need to fly all the time. This is a species typically associated with trees. And if you think about the leaf litter in woodlands that collects and things like that, you get various insects that will make their way through that. And as they do, they make lots of noise. So the bats will fly along. We saw the brown long-eared hovering earlier on, get to the location, drop on the ground, and then just chase after it. And they have these wings designs, which are very broad, so kind of long in that direction there. And that gives them a great deal of lift, so then they can take off from the ground. If you compare that to our nocturnal bats that feed out in the open, they have very long, narrow wings like a fighter jet. So they're great at going at high speeds, but crap at turning. And if they're on the ground, they just don't get enough lift to lift themselves back off, because they're very rarely found on the ground. With our long-eared bats, one of the ways they hunt as well is not down on the ground, but is by taking prey off of foliage. So if you look carefully, can you see the little moth here? Hiding on the underside of the leaf. Bat will come along, hone in, and then kind of just hover there. And there's a fantastic clip on Life of Mammals where it just waits there until the moth moves its leg and it swoops in and picks it off the leaf. So they can run, but they can't hide. So we call this technique gleaning, where they take prey off of the surfaces. One of the key ways we separate and we can identify bats in the hand is by looking at their tail membrane. And it's because their tail membrane's used in how they hunt. So the ones that trawl over water have a fairly basic V shape with long hairs on it that are tactile, and it acts like a trawling net, so it picks up any insects. This one here has curves to it. So it's a big scoop, and it has these fine or thick bristles, on the edge of it. So when it swoops in and picks a spider out of its web like that, it comes away without getting stuck to the spider's web. And you may have heard the expression of blind as a bat. Thought I'd put this up on here. So this is our brown long-eared bat again, and talked about how they hunt a great deal by listening. So they echolocate, so they're very quiet echolocators, but they can hunt just by listening as well. And they have really big eyes for a nocturnal mammal. That's mad, isn't it, right? And it's because that's the kind of one of the final cues they can use as they hone in and find their prey. So next time you hear that, you slap people in the face and tell them they're wrong. Tell them, Jim says you're an idiot. And this is one of our horseshoe bats. This is our greater horseshoe bat. Weird, right? Ugly thing. My least favourite species about that. I can, I absolutely can. Most conservationists think you can, but you definitely can. This is it right here. They have weed in my mouth, they pooed down my neck, they've bitten my finger, like horrible, horrible bats. They do make a good sound though, absolutely good sound. We've talked a bit about how they fly around, what they feed on, and how they hunt. Where do they live? Where do our bats live? Caves? Bats in the belfries? Yeah? Caves, buildings then? Anywhere else?
Under bridges.
Under bridges, trees? Very good. So our horseshoe bats, they evolved in caves. And they are very particular in where they live and where they roost. And they need to be able to fly directly into where they live. So they don't create their own roosting sites. So they're not like birds that will come together in pairs and they build a nest and that's where they raise their young. They use what's already available in the environment. And they're very loyal to these sites, so they come back year on year on year. So they evolved in caves, but as humans started changing the landscape, we started building buildings around the place. And when they were first built, people and bats probably lived side by side quite a great deal, because buildings were poorly made, or they'd get run down very quickly, or pieces of glass would go missing, or doors would be left open. But as we change things like building regs and we are having a push for greener homes, we're essentially just sealing them up and one by one removing any opportunities for bats. And this is one of the reasons why our horseshoe bats are particularly rare, because they're very particular in where they roost. That was the greater horseshoe. This is the lesser horseshoe. This is the cuter cousin of the greater horseshoe. Me and this species are okay, you'll be glad to hear. This one hasn't weed or pooed anywhere near me. So you can see here, in this opening in this building, that stable door that allows them to fly in and out, and this kind of swarming behaviour. We call it light sampling, where they warm up a bit before they leave, and then they make their way out of the building. And even as they go down the building, they hug tight to it, and you can see them disappearing into other openings further down in the building. So they're very much kind of clinging to the edge of things. They don't want to be out in the open. They're very close to the edge there. So our void dwellers, essentially. So they need to fly in and they like a lot of space around them, and it comes from evolving in caves. Many of our other species, though, like to tuck themselves away. So this is the pipistrelle again. Hopefully you can just about see them appearing there, and they kind of like come from nowhere. So these bats will be coming from underneath something like a lifted tile, or behind some fascia boards or barge boards on the outside of a house. So when people hear about bats in buildings, typically they think they're in the loft void. The vast majority are actually on the outside of the building, never coming into contact with people. So they're below the tiles, but above the felts, for example. So these are crevice dwellers. They find kind of any tiny little gap that you can fit into. I used to try and explain about how big the gap needed to be to fit bats in. And someone once said to me, you know, like those 9-volt batteries, imagine that if you could like end on, if you could push that into a feature that's big enough to get a bat. And then I saw one smaller than that. So you know when you buy a new TV and the remote has 2 batteries and they're side by side, AAA's, about that big, I reckon. They're tiny, tiny little bats, about that small. And they're very flexible, so they can kind of tuck themselves in. Cool. Now we're on to the cool bats. This is Barbastelle, the gothest of all bats. Do you know why his scientific name is Barbastella barbastellus? You know what that means in Greek? Starbeard. It's pretty cool, isn't it? And it's due to the frosted tips to its fur. So you can see it's black. It's our only species that's truly black. But a bit like me in the 90s, it had frosted tips. So the kind of just the end of them just died ever so slightly there. And you may notice this kind of very bulbous nose that it has. I mentioned about the horseshoe bats having that structure on their nose through which they echolocate. We have a few others that echolocate through their nose as well. So Barbastelle is one of them. And it produces these sounds just kind of directly outside, up from the top of its nose. So the nostrils are facing upwards. And the beauty of this, you know what the advantage of echolocating through your nose is compared to echolocating through your mouth? Absolutely. But if you echolocate through your mouth and you've caught something, how do you know where you're going? It's going to be problematic, right? So yeah, echolocating through your nose allows them to carry on echolocating whilst they're eating. We talked about the horseshoes and pipistrelles, they're in buildings. This one almost exclusively is in trees. It does turn up in buildings occasionally, perhaps more on the continent. And weirdly, it turns up behind things like shutters that barely offer any protection at all, you know, like wooden window shutters. Where we do find them in buildings, they're typically associated with wood. So presumably that's something in their evolution that they're kind of just comfortable around wood. So you get them under wooden weatherboarding on the edge of buildings. We don't build many houses like that over here. If you go to East Anglia, you find more of them. There's a big, I think, Tudor barn in East Anglia that has a big colony of these in a minute. We don't have shutters either. But yeah, if you find wood on a building, you might find one of these. And when we look at our species that roost in trees, we can kind of subdivide that. So a bit like we could with the building roosters, we have some void dwellers and some crevice dwellers. And our Barbastelle is one of our crevice dwellers. So this is a top of a tree that's just snapped off entirely. And in the process of that snapping, you can see this vertical crack that's split through as well. So this faces upwards. There's no shelter over the top of this. God knows how they get sheltered from the rain and all sorts of weather, but they're quite happily in there. Unfortunately, these are the types of trees that get a lot of attention when it comes to health and safety and risk assessment and things like that. They're also the sorts of trees that foresters aren't particularly interested because they have no value. And so one of the main threats to these species is removal of where they live because they're not seen as valuable or they're seen as potentially dangerous. We saw our Bechstein's bats earlier on, the one with the big ears. Again, another tree specialist, spends its whole summer in the trees, but then goes underground to hibernate in the winter. But instead of a crevice dweller, our Bechstein's is a void specialist. In particular, likes living in woodpecker holes. And woodpeckers are fantastic birds. They create habitat for a range of other species. So they come along, find trees with decay in it, excavate a nest cavity. They kind of move on. They will come back occasionally and use it, but then as that cavity continues to decay, it can be used by species like Bechstein's, but also other birds, other mammals as well. Cool. So that's a bit about where they live. What do you think they're doing at this time of year? If we went and saw a bat now, what are they doing, do you think? Hibernating? They're one of 3 species groups in the UK that hibernates. Sorry, mammals, this is. 3 mammals. What are the other 2? Hedgehogs? And dormice, absolutely, yeah. So why do they hibernate? Their food is abundant in spring and through summer, but as the kind of autumn progresses and as we head into winter, the food just drops off. So there's no point in them being out and about because they starve very, very quickly. So hibernation is interesting, and we used to think that animals would go into hibernation and it would just be one long sleep. Wouldn't that be lovely, right? I'd love that. Just kind of go to sleep in October, wake up in spring. Fantastic. That would be my dream life, I think. But they actually have cycles. They need to wake up every so often. And we're not 100% sure why this is. We think it might be something to do with defense, that if they don't have a metabolism, they didn't have a kind of their immune system running, that they could die from some kind of pathogen or something. There's probably need to reset clocks and their diurnal rhythms within their body so they know when it's going to be dark. Because if you imagine a bat wakes up and it's daytime, they've wasted a lot of energy and they can't do anything about it. At least if it's dark, they can go out and see if they can feed. They also need to take on things like water, maybe go to have a poo as well. If you think about when you go to bed at night, I don't know if you're like me, I put a glass of water next to the bed. That's because we dry out as we breathe in and out, and bats are no different to that. So they typically try to find areas that have high humidity to reduce the effects of that. But it will have a toll over time. So as we see the kind of weather getting colder and colder, and it's a bit mild this year, isn't it? It's quite wet. We haven't really had a cold snap yet. And the same was kind of true last year, that as we progress into winter proper, that's when we see kind of hibernation really take hold. And where bats enter in kind of prolonged periods of sleep called torpor. But they're not completely inactive. The kind of least frequent, they'll be waking up every couple of weeks, just to keep those cycles going, just to go out, maybe take on some more moisture, or feed if they can. And there's various studies looking at greater horseshoe in particular, the species that's very fond of dung and the beetles and other prey associated with it, and showed the importance of cattle grazing in and around their hibernation sites. So when they do wake up, they can pop out for a bit of food and then head back in. And last winter in particular, there's the first time we saw quite a large number of greater horseshoe bats. They typically go underground to hibernate, but a large number of them staying above ground, so still in roof voids and things like that, just because it wasn't getting really, really cold. It's the cold weather that forces them underground. So they go places like this. This is a disused railway tunnel. Bats have a lot to thank beaching for, the railway cuts in the 60s. And they're looking essentially for cold, stable, humid conditions, lots of moisture in the air. And it needs to be above freezing. If it goes below freezing, it's not great, but below about 10 degrees. Because if it goes too high, then their metabolism is going to be running too quickly. And they can switch their systems off basically, so they're warm-blooded like us, they're mammals, but when they want to, they can go into these periods of torpor to match the temperature of the environment. So if that temperature is going up and down, up and down, up and down, that's no good at all. It needs to be nice and stable. And this tunnel is about 600 meters long. And at the center of the tunnel, it's 7 degrees, and it varies by no more than 1 degree up or down. So it's really stable, really constant, it's perfect for bats. And they have options, so they can go right to the center if they need to. Or we've got some frost-hard species that always roost right next to the entrance. And for a long time, we thought, well, okay, well, they're going for a long period of sleep. They're going to be somewhere that's really insulated and a really constant temperature. And now we're realizing actually, well, they do wake up and they do go out to feed. And if they're right in the center, where the conditions are stable, they've got no idea if it warms up outside. So they can't take advantage of that. So we're beginning to understand actually being somewhere exposed, when the conditions do change, when it does warm up enough for them to go out and feed, they can take advantage, pop out, grab a bite to eat, and then come back in. And when they wake up, based on how well they fed, they will then select where they want to hibernate next. And if they fed well, they will go somewhere warmer, which means that next cycle of torpor is shorter, and the hope will be they can go out and feed again. If they didn't feed very well at all, they're going to find somewhere colder. and that period of torpor then can extend up to about 2 weeks. So they're constantly adjusting all the way through the winter. So we think they're kind of inactive. In actual fact, they're busy, they're selecting sites, all going on without us really knowing. I mentioned about how some species like being exposed. So some species will also hibernate in trees. A lot of them spend the summer in trees, but they're kind of a bit wimpish. Come November, December time, they pop off to underground sites. Whereas the noctral, I'm wearing a noctral. This fella right here, this is our biggest bat, hard as nails, spends the whole winter, the whole year in trees. Come what may, doesn't go anywhere else. And as I mentioned, it can take advantage then to go out and feed as and when the conditions change. I went to a European Bats Research Symposium this year. I didn't even know it existed until earlier this year. 5 days of people talking bats. It's a bit much, actually. There was one researcher talking about the brown fat in 2 different species of bat. And it took me a long time to understand what he was saying. But essentially, the ones that hibernate in caves have longer chain fats compared to the ones that hibernate in trees. And essentially what that means is that the one hibernating in caves, if it breaks that fat molecule and starts to burn it, there's a big amount of fat that it suddenly uses up. So it has to be sure it's going to wake up, and then it has to go out and be able to feed or whatever it's going to do and then come back, and it uses up a lot of energy compared to the ones in trees that have shorter molecules, or shorter chains, sorry. So it can start burning some of them, pop out quickly, pop back in, and it's done, and it's only used the proportion of the energy. So it's a bit like a dairy milk. You know the big ones you used to get for Christmas? So the ones that hibernate in caves, they're fats like that once you open that, it's like a Christmas, it goes, right? Well, now, what other time of year would you eat a dairy milk that big in a week? Compared to like a normal sized dairy milk or a fun sized dairy milk. So bats have different sized fats like that. Spring, my favourite season. Think about those long January winter nights. Miserable, isn't it? So then spring rolls around and everything bursts back into life. So the bats will have seen the long winter out. They've built up their fat reserves in the autumn, and those will slowly diminish over the winter, topping up as they go. As we mentioned, when they can go out and feed, they will take that opportunity. But as spring rolls around, certainly by the time we get to March, you'll see much more activity as the bats will kind of head straight out to feed. And then towards the end of spring, we see a different behaviour in the males and the females. So the females will congregate together to give birth. So we have a tree roost here of Bechstein's bats. There are 50 bats in this hole in this tree. And they come together kind of mid to late May to give birth and then to rear their young. Any thoughts about why they come together? What's the advantage of lots of females coming together to give birth? They can look after each other, yeah. Warmth, yeah, absolutely. Nursery, yeah. So there's like a creche. You can just drop the kids off and leave them there. Bats are one of the very few species that show altruism in wild animals as well. So vampire bats, leaving the British Isles for a second, are known that kind of community behaviour, that if a bat is successful, if it goes out and feeds and takes on a lot of blood, it can come back to the roost. If there's one less well off that didn't feed that well that night, it will regurgitate some blood into its mouth. And that's the tax of living together. Delightful, isn't it? We don't have to deal with those. If anyone ever gets worried about vampire bats, people worry about bats kind of landing and sucking blood because of the work of Dracula and things like that. They actually don't attach on the neck. They typically nip at the heels. So it's like cows, they nip at the heels, chickens. There's a Life of Mammal 2 coming out very shortly, and they filmed vampire bats for that. And you see these bats fly to where the chicken coops are, and they just kind of nip at the heels, and then they lap up the blood. And they're so undignified, this. If you think about blood, lots of water in it, very heavy. Before they can take off and fly away, they have to have a big wee. So anyone worried about these vicious predators, the vampire bats, As soon as you realise they need to have a big wee before they can fly off again, kind of demystifies it a bit. So yeah, we have the creche, we have the altruism going on. Mentioned heat as well. Well, we see about, there we go, these are Arborist bats, and they like roosting under lifting bark on trees. So the dead section of trees, or a dead tree in this case, and this is the last piece of bark on that tree. This was July this year, and you can just see the heat given off by these animals. These are the mothers leaving, and at the very end, when it finishes, you can still see that red glow, or that white glow, sorry, in the centre, and that's the heat of the young left behind. And they don't leave them very long, they fly off, they feed for maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then they come back in and suckle the young before going out and feeding again. So it's the temperatures, the body warmth sharing is one of the key aspects of them roosting together. These are Bechstein's bats, and I mentioned that they primarily roost in trees, in voids, in woodpecker holes. They do take to bat boxes. And this is a bat box that had 121 Bechsteins in it. Found them last year, and I've never felt anything like the heat coming off of them. So you might notice they have some jewellery on them. Can you see the colour difference? So this is like a brown here with a ring on. And then this grey one doesn't have a ring on. Or this grey one here. So the brown ones with rings on are the adults. And the grey are the young of the year. So probably about 4 weeks old. And as big as they're going to get, which is about that big. We're beginning to learn, and we don't know very much about bats that live in trees, just because they're so hard to study. They move really frequently. You need to get up into the crown of trees to be able to study them. You need cameras that will go into the features as well. So lots of barriers in our way of kind of learning about them. We're beginning to learn that bats are quite social. So not only do we have 121 Bechstein's bats, on occasions we get some other species mixed in with them as well. So in this colony we occasionally find some male nocturnes. And presumably they just like it warm. I don't know why they're in there. Or they turned up first, maybe, and only to be followed by 121 Bechstein's bats. And it's like when you kind of, that feeling when you get on a bus and like there's loads of spare seats and you pick one and then just it gets full afterwards. People crowd in next to you. Maybe it's that, who knows. So we're kind of rolling on. Young are born in June. They're kind of full size by mid to late July, depending on the weather. These are Arborist doing what they do inside the roost, having a good groom before they go on out, and the young here learning from their parents how they look after it themselves. And then soon enough, they're off and feeding independently. And what will happen is that the young get left in those roosts and the females will disappear off. Because you may notice I haven't mentioned something yet. Do we need to have the talk? So we've had the young, well, we haven't explained how the young are made. So bats are kind of backwards in this way. That they mate at the end of the year before they go into hibernation. So we started just heading into hibernation, we started now. It's always difficult to know where to start with the year in the life of a bat. So I generally pick whatever time we're trying to do this talk and then go from there. So as we kind of head on in, we then start seeing mating. But before we get there, I know what all the men are thinking. We've heard about the women, what about the men? They're doing the sensible thing, they're living on their own. This is a pipistrelle, just minding his own business, on his own, no hassle, no stress. He likes it like that. He does. He's fond of his own company, it's fine, it's absolutely fine. And the advantage of living on your own and not having to give birth and rear young is that you don't need to keep your systems going all the time. So we talked about how the females need to stay warm, but the male bats don't need to do that. So as well as going into torpor over the winter for extended periods, they can go into torpor on a daily basis. So they come back. Doing nothing, absolutely, that's fine. I think I'll speak for everyone in the room. We're happy with that, absolutely happy with that. And in return, what we know is that we're very courteous, and very chivalrous in this way that male bats, they roost in the suboptimal habitats to allow the females to go and feed in the good places. And they also emerge later to give the females the first bite of the cherry to get the insects, because it's more important for the species as a whole that the females can give birth and rear their young successfully, and the males are kind of secondary to that. Cool. We're moving on to date night. Yes, we're back with our nocturnal bat. So another species that likes voids in trees, again, woodpecker holes. And August onwards, probably still seeing a touch of it about now, tailing off as it gets slightly colder. They want to find a mate. So how do you think bats find mates? Absolutely. Is that how you find mates? Absolutely. This is a male bat singing from his territory. So it's similar to if you've seen lekking on Autumn Watch, where the male holds a territory and parades around and then fights the other males. It's kind of similar to that, where it defends a kind of resource, and it basically says, look how good I am. Look at this woodpecker hole. This is fantastic, isn't it? And just down there's a river to go and feed, and they set out their territories and then they sing to call the females in. So these are our mating roosts. And typically with the nocturals, they're very aggressive, very territorial. So they will sing to attract the females in, and then they typically wait by the entrance because they don't want another nocturnal bat coming in and taking the ladies that he's managed to woo already. And they hibernate the whole time through the winter in the tree. So you typically find that one right by the entrance, almost blocking it, with other females tucked up behind. And this is a nocturnal bat scent marking outside of a woodpecker hole. You can see him rubbing his neck. This is kind of August, towards the end of August, rubbing his neck, making it nice and smelly. This is where the scent comes in. And this is a male singing as well, singing away. And is he successful? Let's find out. There we go. Look at that. Get in there. I've been told it's Barry White, if that. These are our pipistrelle bats. We have 3 species of pipistrelle in the UK. We used to think we just had one originally, and then researchers at Bristol Uni found out that there were 2 separate of the small ones, and then we had the slightly bigger ones. See the one on the left is slightly bigger? Yeah. This is the Thusius pipistrelle. It's a very bizarre animal, the Thusius pipistrelle. So about that big, quite a small animal, and likes water bodies. Coastlines, maybe rivers, lakes, reservoirs, that type of thing. And it was first in the UK, particularly well studied in Northern Ireland because of the large lakes and water bodies up there. This is Blagden Lake, just south of Bristol. And maybe 10 or so years ago, there was a ring put on the Thusius bat at this site. And a few weeks later, it turned up in Holland. 600, almost 600 kilometres as the crow flies. That's the green line going from the UK in the other direction. And that sparked a research project, where people started going out specifically trying to catch this bat. So this is another bat that sings, has a very diverse song. And if you play that back in its territory, it responds to it. So it ends up in your trap. And you can put a ring on it, and then if you capture it again, you know the same individual and you can mark where they go, essentially. Meanwhile, whilst we were doing that in the UK, we had European colleagues also doing very similar things. So you can see the yellow arrow there is from Lithuania and the white one's from Latvia. And these are bird ringing stations. And it's well known that birds migrate. It's kind of well known that bats migrate in Europe, but we're the UK, so we like to think we do things differently here, of course. And amazingly, we get bats turning up from Latvia and Lithuania just because people were actually going out to survey specifically for this species. And it doesn't stop there. The number of records and rings, just because people go out to catch these species, but also know how to do it. Once we understand the ecology of the species, we know where to go, we know how to catch them. We're seeing more and more of them. So we can see huge distances here, again, as the crow flies. So presumably, there's much longer distance than that. And this was something that we kind of thought was going on for a long time, because these bats were turning up on oil rigs, or they're turning up on ferries. And the question with the boats and shipping, I've seen occasionally they turn up at Bristol docks, Avonmouth, and the suggestion is, well, it just came on the boat though, didn't it? But we don't know at which point it got on the boat. It's not like a human that has to get on land. It can get on at any point. And it continues. So the furthest record now is just over 2,000 kilometres from Russia.
Is this seasonal migration?
Yes, absolutely. So they move from south and west to north and east during the summer, just like birds as it warms up, and then they turn around and come south and west for the winter. Most of our species are relatively sedentary. There are others that will migrate like this in search of food. And it's typically the ones that have wing designs which allow them to fly great distances. But the enthusiast doesn't really have that. It has quite a broad wing, which is more adapted for slow flight. So it's a bit of a conundrum how it does it, really. I mentioned the European Bat Research Symposium. One of the good talks that came out of 5 days was they have a species called the greater noctule in Europe. So I talked about the noctules, our biggest bat, bigger again, as the name suggests. We'll take passerine birds, feeds on birds, and it's so big they can put a GPS tag on it. So we study bats normally with a radio transmitter, and that's great, but you need to be close to it with a big antennae to follow where it goes. GPS tags send signals to GPS, obviously. And for some reason, they put a microphone on it. I don't know why. I don't know if it came with a microphone, but these Spanish researchers are like, I want to know what these bats are saying. And the researcher played this sound clip, and it goes, woof, 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 and that's the wings beating. And then it goes, and that was a bat eating something, and just crunching through a bird, presumably. And they were finding that they were flying from Spain to Poland. Massive distances in like very short time frames. It's younger cousins. So I mentioned we have noctule. We also have a species called Leisler's bat, or in Europe it's called the lesser noctule. Quite scarce, widespread, but quite scarce. It's common in Ireland where they don't have any noctules. So presumably there's a relationship there where one displaces the other. And we found some in Wick, down in South Gloucestershire. We put a tag on it. Medium-sized bat, quite small. Every night it went 6 kilometres. Different direction every single. It was a nightmare to follow. Lesser horseshoes, I showed you earlier on, 300 metres in a night. I can do that from one spot and go, oh, I was over there now. I was over there, great. Sit in my car, have my tea. The Leisler's was very challenging, 6 kilometres. And then one night it flew 14 kilometres over to Box. Did something in a woodland for about half an hour and then flew back. That was the first record of a Leisler's bat in Wiltshire. Yeah. Because you can't rely on bat detector sounds of them, and no one's actually ever caught them in the hand. So there's no evidence it touched down in Wiltshire. You don't want to touch the soil in Wiltshire, clearly. Just fly into it, fly out of it. Now for the doom and gloom part, sorry. Has to happen. I mentioned that I work in nature conservation. This was from State of the Nature reports a few years ago. And you can see these just general trends. These are kind of relative numbers, the kind of starting point of 100 there. And we presume that decline started before this point in 1970. We just didn't have any reliable data to inform it. But the trend is not good. So these are UK priority species, not just bats, kind of range of other species. But that downward trend is not particularly good. And there's a range of reasons for that. And it's largely to do with how we have changed our environment. So whether that's changes to agriculture like this, where we've moved from small field parcels and tries to mechanise agriculture to make it more efficient, removing hedgerows, removing trees. If you think about this landscape, this is not far, this is between Wootton and Charfield. If you think about the horseshoe bats, which are around us as we speak, one of the ways they save energy is by hanging up on trees. If you take out the hedgerows with their hedgerow trees, that becomes a particular issue. If you think about the agricultural subsidies that are paid to farmers to flail hedges to keep them in check. That removes any overhanging vegetation which the horseshoes could hang on. So very simple things we can do, just providing somewhere where bats can hang. So if you have hedgerows, just having some overhanging vegetation makes a big difference. But even things like shifting from hay to silage, cutting slightly early in the year, cutting when the flowers haven't arrived yet or appeared, moving away from species-rich grassland to essentially monoculture, perennial ryegrass, all of these types of things. And we know that we've seen devastating losses in our wildflower meadows, and that's again kind of linked to how we have chosen to manage our land and the subsidies that kind of go with that as well. And we've seen kind of corresponding declines in bat species as well. Again, with this idea of opening up fields to allow machines in has resulted in hedgerow loss, which, whether it's perching spots for horseshoe bats or whether it's nesting spots for birds or protection offered to invertebrates that then the bats can feed on, bats and birds can feed on, we see these impacts. Here we have our grey long-eared bat. We haven't heard about the grey long-eared yet. Heard about his slightly more common cousin, the brown long-eared bat. But whilst the brown long-eared bat is widespread and relatively common and it's typically found in woodlands, the grey long-eared bat is a species that likes rich meadows. So you need a kind of diversity of plants essentially to attract the prey in to have this species. We know very little about grey long-eared. A colleague was out this year trying to catch more. Anyone catch country file when they were at Montacute House? No, they over the summer, and they were doing some bits for bats, and they were radio tracking grey long-eareds at the time down in Montacute. They seem to be linked with coastlines, so we have them in Jersey and Guernsey, quite common and widespread there. And when you get them in the UK, it's around Dorset, Devon, extends up to South Gloucestershire, but no further north that we know of. So there seems to be some link with coastlines we're not particularly aware of. And they're beginning to find them associated with old churches. So whether these are like meeting points. So they don't live in the church, but they set nets across the entrance, you know, like porches you get into churches. And they were catching 3 or 4 individuals on a night. We're not quite sure why that is. Lots to find out. If you want something to study, this is why bats are so interesting. Anyone read Silent Spring? Yeah. I've got a second-hand copy there, and inside of it you can see that this book was first published 1965 and spoke of the perils of chemical pesticides, DDT in particular. And unfortunately, the kind of story has continued since then, and Dave Golson is perhaps the most famous author since then, talking about the kind of insect apocalypse, particularly focusing on bumblebees, and his latest one, or one of his latest one, about Silent Earth. And it's no different, really. Just large chemical companies lobbying government to allow them to sell these chemicals until they eventually get banned, and then they just sell a different one. And it shifts so fast, and there's so many vested interests that we're kind of fighting kind of an uphill battle. In one of, I don't know if you read Dave's book, they're very interesting, and he talked about how they did a fairly non-scientific test of going to garden centres. And I don't know if you've seen that RHS pollinator sticker on plants. And so they took some of those away, and it was remarkable the number of those they found traces of these chemical pesticides in. So this thing that people are trying, the consumers trying to make a good choice and plant these things for insects in their gardens, only to have actually be introducing these pesticides as residues in these plants. So we see, this is Bechstein's bat here. I talked about how it lands and forages on the ground and inside of woodlands, but they're not exempt. So whilst the woodlands aren't being treated, these things drift because they're sprayed. They don't necessarily need to be calibrated, these machines. You need very little training in how to use them, and off you go, and it can just be sprayed anywhere, right? So there's no real regulation of it. It's fairly minor, and there's no kind of focus on calibration or things like that. We see impacts of things like livestock worming as well. So I talked about the fantastic resource that dung has. And one of the fantastic ways that farming can make a difference. So I manage a couple of reserves down in Buckfastleigh in Devon. Greater horseshoe bats. That was where I got weed in the mouth and poo down the neck. Call back to earlier on. 2,000 bats there. And we get our veg from Riverford. Don't know anyone gets the same. And you get Guy's newsletter through each week. Find it quite inspirational to read what Guy's up to. And there was one time when he wrote about greater horseshoe bats, and he'd been speaking to Devon Wildlife Trust. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. And I then cleared out the bat poo from this reserve. 2,000 bats makes a lot of bat poo. 70 bags, you know, there's like rubble bags, 70 bags of bat poo. And I was thinking, what am I going to do with this? And in the past, I think it's gone to allotments and local people, volunteers to help out with it. And I thought, well, I wonder whether we could make something a bit more, better use of this. And then I saw a video pop up a few days later on Riverford's social media, and they talked about they've recorded lots of bats last year. And this young person talking about how fantastic it was, in particular, loads and loads of greater horseshoe bats. And I was like, that's interesting, I wonder where they are. I looked on a map, and they are the other side of the river to our reserve. So I got into contact with them and said, I think your bats are our bats, and our bats are your bats, and I've got 70 bags of shit, would you like it back? So I'm currently working with them to see if we can close that circle, basically, because that biomass pretty much definitely came off of their land. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that that roost of bats is bigger by at least 100, double the size of any other greater horseshoe roost in the country. And that must be because of the farmland that it's next to. So I've got a few slides that talk about what we can do, and buying responsible food, if we can afford it, is definitely one of those. And one of the things that Guy talked about in one of the most recent letters was about farm washing, and how our supermarkets paint lovely pictures of tractors and happy chickens and have no real connection to the things they're selling. Because as consumers, we've forced them to push prices down rather than actually understand where our food is coming from. So we can see our species that are reliant on dung, there's an impact when livestock needs to be wormed. So organic farming is great if it can happen. If it can't happen, there's simple things that can manage that as well. So it just goes through the system and comes out the other end. So simple things that can be done is just keep cattle on concrete, keep them in the barns whilst that passes through. Once it's done, let them back out on pasture. But I mentioned earlier on about how the winter grazing of cattle is particularly important for greater horseshoes. And we're seeing a decrease in that now, especially with our wetter winters, because if you let the cattle out, it's just going to churn up the ground, isn't it? So that's probably going to have an impact on our bats and our opportunistic feeding. Tree risk. So we mentioned at the beginning, I'm an arborist, so my particular fondness are for the tree-dwelling bats. You may have picked that up with my hatred for greater horseshoe bats. We have suffered from a kind of a secondary risk culture for too long. And that's all about, okay, if a tree falls over and people are responsible for managing that risk, they're not worried about what will happen if the tree falls over. They're worried about what will happen to them if the tree falls over. So that led to kind of fairly overzealous pruning. And as a result, then we see declines in not just bat species. I worked for a charity called the Ancient Tree Forum. And in the short time I worked there, I used to deliver a training course on management of veteran trees. And this figure at the start was 12% of European beetle species were threatened. The saprophyte ones, the dead wood specialist. So this is literally changing before our eyes because trees are being removed for whatever reason from our landscapes. And in particular, it's the big old ones that have this red or brown rot in the centre that's valuable. And if we extend it to bats then, do we have any bats? There they are. These are Barbastella again. I've mentioned earlier on they like roosting under lifting bark, and typically you find lifting bark on dead trees or dead parts of trees. And these are inevitably the ones that foresters want to get rid of, or risk managers want to remove, or they're unsightly, or whatever reason. There's lots of pressure to remove them, but even if they're not, that bark won't last forever. A couple of years if we're lucky, and then it'll have to move on to find another area to roost. So, what can we do? I mentioned earlier on about, think about where food comes from. If you have the disposable income or are willing to spend a greater proportion of your money on food that you know has come from a particular area, if it's organic, fantastic. Even if it's local, even if you're kind of supporting agriculture directly, that's one thing. This is my garden. I'm very lucky to have a wonderful garden. We moved to Wootton a couple of years ago. I live on the side of the hill. The guy who lived there before it, 60 metres long, our garden, used to cut it with a lawnmower with an extension lead he built himself. Madness, absolutely madness. At the very top, the left-hand photo there, was an area he cleared and had all of these wonderful wildflowers. And before we moved in, he said, I might rip all this out and put grass down. And we're like, please don't. We let the grass grow, and we had 14 pyramidal orchids appear the following year, and 2 common spotted orchids. There's primroses, lots of kind of introduced things as well. But these are essentially the foundation of our food webs, right? It feeds our insects, which feed our mammals, our birds, reptiles, etc., etc. So you may be familiar with initiatives like No Mow May. I'm no mow at all. I've got myself a scythe. I do one cut at the end of the year, much better. And you're saving the energy that goes into power those things as well. And then, so food is one thing. The other side of the thing then is thinking about where bats live. And the classic thing that people say is like, well, you can put boxes up. But you can see some designs here. So you get some that go on trees, some that go on buildings. You get some that actually get incorporated into the buildings. Perhaps they're better because they're longer lived. But yeah, there's lots of options if you want to provide a home for bats. You can even make your own. That was doom and gloom. I'm going to pick you back up again. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. Remember this chap? Male nocturnal bat. This is earlier in the year. We saw him in August and he was in full-fledged, right? He is full of testosterone. He has come back to his roost. He's ready for love. And what does he find? He finds a grey squirrel. What a nightmare. We've all had it happen to us, haven't we, lads? He's not going to give up, though. And we get to a point where there's a bit of a stalemate between the squirrel here, and he's throwing punches from inside the hole. And the nocturnal thinks, well, sod it, I'm going in. That squirrel is in a whole world of pain. Look at that face. Look at that face. And I increasingly get worried about the impacts of invasive species like grey squirrel. I've been told by a few people they've heard parakeets, not around here, but in Wales recently, things that will compete with our natural species for cavities like this. And this video gave me a bit of heart, because it made me laugh, if not. But the following part of the video absolutely astounded me, that he then comes out and he carries on singing. That bat won that fight. And there were 2 cameras in this tree. You may have noticed some other ones flashing. This camera didn't pick it up. On the other camera, you see just like a squirrel-shaped blur leaving. And if you're in any doubt about the bat winning the fight, look at the date, look at the time. This is 23rd of July, 11 o'clock at night. A few hours later, he's busy again, rubbing his neck. He is happy, happy days. He turfed that grey squirrel out of that roost. So thank you very much for listening. Those are my details there. If you're on social media, I'm at Bats RTS. It's one of the requirements I actually say before people take badges, you need to follow me on social media. If you don't have social media, you want to catch any of the videos you've seen this evening, they're all on the YouTube channel, which is Bats in Trees. And that QR code there takes you to my website. Thanks for listening. The question was, are there any particular trees? Do you mean tree species? Not really. It was more about the feature and whether the feature will form. So I showed some examples. So woodpecker holes, for example. You get them in a whole range of tree species, but they persist longer in things like oak compared to willows. And so presumably the ones in oak are perhaps a bit more valuable. I heard a talk recently that a woodpecker hole in an oak tree in the Isle of Wight had been used for the last 25 years. And so if it can persist, that's probably quite valuable. There's other splits and cracks. So there's a crack that forms as a curved branch straightens. And you only get them on certain species. So again, things like oak, yew, walnut. If you look at willows, poplars, ash trees, they don't hang around long enough, they just snap off entirely, basically. So it's more about the features. So some features will form in some trees, but not others. But if a feature there, then the bats can be there. What eats bats? So there's a range of predators. So I mentioned about the large roost, the greater horseshoe bats. Last year and this year, we've had a barn owl move in, start eating bats. We've had torn owls move in different roost sites. I've also, the cameras I showed you of the nocturnal singing and attracting the mate and fighting the squirrel, the cameras that have been up on those roosts, every single one of them that's a cavity is visited by stoats. And I was blown away when I saw that. And I saw the temperature and it was -9 and I was like, I didn't know stoats go in trees. And I had to kind of check myself and I was like, Jim, you've only ever seen 2 stoats and they were both crossing the road. Because like, who's going to see a stoat up in the trees? So those are the kind of the natural ones, and I guess that would extend to things like pine martens if in that kind of area. In terms of, as we come into more urban areas, cats are a really big one, especially where you have large roost sites because they're very clever animals, they're very nimble, they can get to where the bats come out. And if you have lots of bats coming out after one, after the other, the cats can kind of just swipe at them. I've heard that some birds of prey take them as well, but I've not seen any evidence of that, but it kind of makes sense that they would be able to take them like a sparrowhawk, potentially. When they leave, if you think, even if you're close to a big roost, so I live in Sinnel, and last year I noticed I had ceratines flying, and I noticed like one after the other will come. So there must be a roost a few houses down, I think. Is it World's End? Some really nice houses set back from the road. I think it might be in there somewhere. If they hung around the roost, the food would disappear very quickly, so they need to disappear out, and they all have their favoured patches that they feed in. So first thing they do is they disappear off. But it could also be that you think you're seeing one bat and it's multiple bats. Yeah, it happens in roosts as well. So you can go in and say, oh, there's like 10 bats in here. And the next day, oh, there's 10 bats in here. And if you put rings on them, you'll notice actually the individuals change. So the roost as a whole stays constant, but the individuals within it change. So yeah, questions about whether they go out and stay out. And the answer is no, they do what we do. That they're active for as long as they need to be. And if you think about what you do during a day, so think about your days off on a weekend, you might go out for a bit, you see some friends, you go to a coffee shop, you sit down, you take the weight off for a bit, and then you go somewhere else maybe. And so they have this behaviour that's driven by food. If they've eaten enough, that's it. They can go back home if they want to. They have these structures that they use in the middle of the night as well. They call them night roosts. So if they are travelling out a great distance, say, and there's food, and there's typically more food on the wing at dusk and dawn. There's an amazing word for this called crepuscular. And so you don't want to come all the way back then to go back at dawn, so they could go and hang up there, wait for the insects to come back and then feed and then return. That sounds like a night roost or a feeding perch. So we spoke earlier on about how they echolocate through their mouths, and if they catch something, what do they do then? So sometimes they take that prey and hang up so they can eat it, and they drop the discarded bits. So I collected a load of bits of dung beetle this week, where greater horseshoes come and hung up, chewed its prey, chucked out the bits he doesn't want, and then flies back out again. The simple answer is you don't really know. We're governed by very few incidental sightings of them. And there's an increasing body of evidence. So those greater nocturals I mentioned with the GPS tags, that records altitude as well, I think. So I can't remember off the top of my head what heights they were flying at. I know there was a film a few years ago called The Batman of Mexico. And it was the species of bats that pollinates the flower that they make tequila from. And they migrate from Mexico up to the US. And they were getting these like swarms of something appearing on radar, like thousands of feet high. And it turned out it was bats and insects, bats going after the insects and then kind of flying at that height. So I guess it makes some sense, both ways actually, that if you think about planes, long haul flights, they go as high as they can to fly. But then I guess it depends on whether you get a tailwind or a headwind as well, doesn't it? If you've got a tailwind, maybe it's lower down. But it's an area we just don't know much about because our knowledge is largely based on, we caught a bat here, we put a ring on it, we then caught it here, and what happened in between, we don't really know. Yes, so there's lots of different designs and makes. There's one that I quite like, which is around about the £100 mark, and it's called a magenta. And there's one with like a dial, like an analog dial, but the one with the light up LCD screen is better, because if you think about you're going out in the dark, you don't want to get a torch out to light it up and lose your night vision. So I think it's like the magenta 5 or something like that, but look for the LCD screen, and they're fairly decent. It's good.
Reliable.
Yeah. You can get some that you build yourself, a bit more hit and miss. If you go to, there's a few companies that specialise in ecology equipment. So there's one called Wildcare. There's also one called NHBS, Natural History Books S. I don't know what the S is for. One of the easiest places to go is if you can find some water. So typically,
Maybe along where the stream is.
yeah, normally you want to, so water is good because you have insects. If you have a large enough water body that's relatively, like the surface is still, you can pretty much guarantee getting Daubenton's because they're flying low and constant. So those are a really good place to start and kind of move from there, I guess. So I think typically it's like, if you start there and then start wandering around, and hopefully you can. There will be winners and losers, is the upshot of it. So I mentioned grey long-eared. That's predicted potentially to be one of the winners. That's quite rare at the moment, but inevitably there will be losers as well. I saw a talk about genomics in the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, and they looked at a particular species of bat and the genetics of it. And I don't know how they did this, but they worked out these genes prefer cold and wet, and these ones prefer hot and dry. And then they modelled what the climate would look like under climate change and say, okay, well, the ones that like cold and wet are going to struggle, and the ones that like hot and dry might do a bit better. And then they were looking at that kind of national level to say, okay, well, they're going to be forced from this area into this area. Can we connect these landscapes up, these habitats up to facilitate that movement? But yeah, the main thing is it's unpredictable, and we've seen that some species have done well out of human occupation, the pipistrelles, for example, and then others not so well. So it's bound to be the same with bats. It's stemming from the fact that we've lost lots of habitats. So the concept originally came from the idea of veteran tree management. Yeah. And we have these wonderful trees, and there's a kind of mindset that trees like company. We think about woodlands and canopies touching. Actually, our oldest trees grow in the open because they have space to stretch out rather than going high. And so one of the main management tools for those trees was removing the young trees that were growing up next to them and overshadowing them. And someone thought, well, rather than, like, we want decaying wood habitats, that's what veteran tree management is, the core of it's about. Rather than just removing those trees, could we damage them and see if they develop those at a younger age? And that was found to have quite a lot of success for mainly wood decay, fungi and invertebrates. But bats started turning up in them. So I borrowed the concept, we adjusted the technique slightly, and it's a management tool. So this is one of the challenging things to communicate about it. It's not just we do that and it fixes everything. So the kind of analogy I use is like a toolbox with a hammer in. If you want to hit a nail in, fantastic tool. If you want to put a screw in, it's no use at all. Yeah. And so it's about using that appropriately where you can. And our study was trying to just say, well, does this work for bats and which species of bats? So then hopefully we can share that, and other people who are working on development or whatever projects can then adopt those techniques if it's appropriate. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this evening. It's
Thank you.
absolutely tremendous. I hope everyone here has as well. I'd like us to thank Jim.
Okay.